The night the Soviet sailors arrived in Cold Bay didn't feel like the beginning of a partnership. It felt strange, uncertain, almost unreal, as if the war itself had taken an unexpected turn and dropped two uneasy allies into the same frozen corner of the world. The American sailors were already waiting on the pier. They stood, bundled in thick parkas and heavy gloves, boots half buried in wet slush. Their breath drifted into the cold air in slow white clouds, while the dim base lights cast long shadows across the docks. Behind them stood warehouses, fuel tanks, radio towers, and the silent shapes of ships moored along the harbor. Cold Bay was not a place people normally visited. It was isolated, wind-beaten, and cold, even by Alaskan standards. But tonight, it had become something unusual. A meeting point between two powers that did not fully trust each other. Out on the dark water, shapes began to emerge through the fog. At first, they looked like shadows moving slowly across the bay. Then the silhouettes grew larger until the outlines of Soviet transport ships appeared, creeping toward the docks like cautious giants. The ship's engines rumbled quietly as they approached. Metal hulls groaned under the cold, and anchors splashed into the icy water with a heavy echo that rolled across the harbor. For a moment, everything stopped. The American sailors watched. The Soviet crews stared back. Even the gulls circling above the bay seemed to fall silent. Between them lay only a few yards of frozen dock, but the distance felt much larger than that. These were men who would soon become enemies in another war, but tonight they were allies. The first Soviet sailors stepped down the gangway carefully, boots landing on the wooden planks of the pier. Their movements were stiff and cautious, their eyes scanning everything around them. Many of them had never left the Soviet Far East before. They had never seen Alaska. They had never stood face to face with American naval crews. But the most surprising sight waited just beyond the pier. Ships. Not the aging vessels they expected, not worn-out patrol boats or leftover cargo ships. Instead, sleek American-built warships sat in the harbor, freshly painted and fully equipped. Their hulls gleamed under the floodlights. Gun mounts stood ready along their decks, and radar antennas turned slowly above the bridges. One Soviet lieutenant stopped halfway down the gangway when he saw them. He stared at the vessels for several seconds without speaking. These ships were modern, far more advanced than most Soviet vessels in the Soviet Pacific Fleet. And in that moment, a quiet realization formed in his mind. No country gives away ships like these without a reason. Across the dock, American sailors watched the Soviet crews just as carefully. They noticed the rigid posture, the serious expressions, the way the Soviet sailors carried themselves with a kind of guarded discipline. There was little smiling, little conversation. These men had not traveled across the Pacific to make friends. They had come to learn quickly, because time was running out. The war in Europe was nearly finished, but the Pacific War still burned fiercely. And somewhere inside American military headquarters, planners had already decided that the Soviet Union would soon play a role in ending it. Cold Bay was where that plan would begin. The Soviet sailors looked around the base as they were led inland. Barracks stood in neat rows against the hills. Fuel tanks were arranged in precise lines near the shoreline. Trucks moved steadily between warehouses, and cables were coiled neatly beside equipment sheds. Everything looked orderly, purposeful. One Soviet sailor muttered quietly to the man beside him, "This does not look like a war base." The other man glanced at the ships in the harbor and shrugged. "It looks like a factory," he said, "a factory that builds navies." The Americans gathered them the next morning for their first briefing. The meeting took place inside a long wooden hall that smelled faintly of damp timber and engine oil. A single iron stove clanked loudly in the corner, struggling to keep the room warm. Maps covered the walls. Large charts of the North Pacific, the Kuril Islands, Sakhalin, and the northern approaches to Japan. Rows of Soviet officers filled the benches, while American instructors stood at the front of the room holding stacks of diagrams and training manuals. The translators had the hardest job. Every technical term had to cross the language barrier.
fuel manifold, radar range, mine-sweeping cables, sound-powered telephones. The American instructors quickly realized that simple explanations worked best, so they shortened their sentences. They used gestures when words failed. One instructor pointed at a diagram of a ship's engine room. He tapped the page with his finger. "Check this every day," he said slowly. The translator repeated it in Russian. The Soviet officers nodded and wrote notes. Another instructor demonstrated a valve mechanism. "This lever," he explained, tapping it twice, "controls pressure. If it sticks, the engine overheats." He paused, then added bluntly, "And if the engine overheats, the ship dies." The room grew very quiet, because everyone understood that part perfectly. Training began the following day. The wind cut across the harbor like a blade as Soviet crews marched toward the ships that would soon become theirs. American sailors were already waiting on the decks. Hatches were open. Engine rooms were lit. The training would begin immediately. But the first lessons were not about combat. They were about familiarity. American instructors led Soviet sailors across the decks step by step. "Count the ladders," one instructor said. "Learn every hatch. Memorize the layout." Another added quietly, "If you can't find your way through the ship in the dark, you're already dead." Below deck, engine rooms roared with noise. Pistons pumped steadily. Steam pipes rattled softly. Soviet engineers studied every gauge and dial carefully. One American mechanic leaned against a bulkhead watching them. Finally, he said something that the translator repeated slowly. "Don't think of this ship as American." He tapped the metal wall beside him. "Think of it as stubborn." He grinned slightly. "If you treat her right, she'll bring you home." The Soviet sailors nodded, because sailors everywhere understood that idea. On the surface decks, the gunnery crews had already begun their lessons. A Soviet gunner approached a 40mm Bofors cannon mounted along the rail. He placed both hands on the controls and slowly moved the weapon. The gun rotated smoothly, far smoother than the older mounts he had trained on before. He tried again, this time faster. The weapon swung easily across the horizon. The American instructor watching him gave a small approving nod. "Don't fight the gun, guide it." They practiced aiming at imaginary aircraft in the fog. Left, right, up, down. Loading drills followed. Shell casings clattered across the deck, while instructors shouted commands in English and Soviet officers repeated them in Russian. Muscles burned, hands grew numb in the cold, but slowly the crews began to move like they belonged there. At first, the moments between training were awkward. Americans smoked cigarettes on one side of the dock. Soviets stood quietly on the other. But eventually, someone offered a cigarette across the gap. A Soviet sailor accepted it, and that small gesture broke the ice. In the mess hall, the strangeness continued. Long tables filled with 2 different languages. American sailors finished meals quickly and left. Soviet sailors stayed longer, studying unfamiliar dishes. One afternoon, someone brought in crates of Coca-Cola bottles. The Soviets stared at them suspiciously. An American sailor opened one and took a long drink. Then he shrugged. "Still alive," he said. A Soviet petty officer finally tried one. The carbonation hit his throat and he nearly coughed the drink back out. The Americans laughed. After a moment, he laughed too. And just like that, the distance between them shrank a little. Outside the barracks, storms rolled in from the Aleutian Sea. Wind rattled the windows, rain hammered the roofs. And inside the workshops and engine rooms, Americans and Soviets worked side by side. Slowly, the strange naval school at Cold Bay began to function. Engines were dismantled and rebuilt. Mine-sweeping equipment was tested again and again. Navigation crews studied the charts of the Kuril Islands. By late spring, Cold Bay had transformed into something unexpected. Not just a training base, but a place where strangers were turning into crews. And soon the ships waiting in the harbor would leave Alaska, not for training, but for war.
The day the ships were officially transferred began quietly. Cold Bay looked almost peaceful that morning. The sea was unusually calm, and the low gray sky reflected across the water like dull metal. For once the wind had eased, and the harbor felt strangely still. American sailors lined one side of the pier. Soviet crews stood opposite them. Between the two groups floated the ships that had brought them together. Minesweepers, subchasers, landing craft, patrol vessels. More than 100 ships had passed through Cold Bay during the training program, each one built in American shipyards and now waiting to sail under a different flag. The transfer ceremony was brief. There were no bands, no speeches meant for newspapers. This operation had always been secret, and it remained that way even now. An American naval officer stepped forward holding the official documents. His voice carried across the quiet pier as he read the transfer orders. These vessels are placed under Soviet operational command for the prosecution of the war against Japan. He paused briefly before continuing. They are to be maintained and used according to agreed procedures and will be returned after the cessation of hostilities. The Soviet captain, listening to the translation, simply nodded. He stepped forward and accepted the documents. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for: the flags. American sailors climbed the masts first. Slowly and carefully, they lowered the stars and stripes from each ship. The fabric moved softly in the cold wind as it came down. No one spoke. The silence felt heavier than any ceremony. Then Soviet sailors stepped forward carrying their own flag. The red banner with its hammer and sickle rose up the mast quickly and snapped in the wind. For a few seconds, both crews watched it flutter above the deck. Nothing dramatic happened. No thunder, no cheers, just the quiet sound of wind across the harbor. An American petty officer finally stepped toward a Soviet gunner standing beside one of the ships. He nodded toward the vessel now flying the Soviet flag. "She's a good ship," he said quietly. "Treat her right." The Soviet sailor answered slowly in broken English, "We will fight with her." He paused, "And we will bring her back, if the sea allows." Engines started across the harbor one by one. Smoke rose from funnels. The newly transferred ships eased away from the docks, their propellers stirring the gray water of Cold Bay. American instructors watched them go. Some of those instructors had helped build or commission the vessels now disappearing into the fog. Now those ships were heading toward a war the Americans themselves would not fight. Once the fleet cleared the harbor, the ocean reminded everyone that training was over. The first swells rolled beneath the hulls only a few hours after leaving Cold Bay. At first, the movement was gentle, but soon the waves grew larger. Heavy rolling swells lifted the ships slowly before dropping them into deep troughs of dark water. Deck plates creaked and loose equipment rattled inside the hulls. Many Soviet sailors were new to these vessels. They gripped railings and bulkheads while the ships pitched beneath them. Then the weather worsened. Wind howled across the open sea. Spray crashed against the bridges. A minesweeper climbed the face of a steep wave and hung for a brief moment before slamming back down hard enough to rattle the entire ship. Inside the engine rooms, the noise became overwhelming. Engines roared, pipes rattled, tools slid across metal surfaces. A Soviet engineer stared at the pressure gauges again and again, making sure nothing was drifting out of tolerance. On the bridge above him, the captain fought to keep formation. "Hold course," he ordered. "Maintain distance." The ships pressed onward through the storm. Then the fog arrived. It closed around the fleet so suddenly that sailors on deck barely had time to react. One moment the ships ahead were clearly visible. The next moment they vanished. The world shrank into a blank wall of white. Sound became the only reliable guide. Engines, waves, radio signals crackling through the fog. Captains reduced speed and relied on the navigation drills they had practiced back in Cold Bay. Bearings were called out, distances checked. Sonar operators listened carefully for anything unusual beneath the water. At one point, a subchaser appeared suddenly out of the fog only a few hundred meters away. Its bow sliced dangerously close across another vessel's path before both ships corrected course. But the line held. Hours passed before the fog finally thinned. Slowly, the shapes of the other ships reappeared across the gray water. They were battered by the storm, but they were still in formation.
An American observer on board one escort ship leaned against the rail and watched the Soviet crews moving confidently across the decks. He shook his head in quiet admiration. They're not trainees anymore. They're crews. By the time the fleet reached Soviet waters, their mission had become clear. They were heading toward the Kuril Islands. These islands formed a long chain stretching between Japan and the Soviet Far East, and they were heavily defended. The American-built ships now under Soviet command were immediately assigned to combat operations. Minesweepers cleared sea lanes, subchasers hunted submarines, escort ships protected troop transports preparing for amphibious landings. The first sign of enemy contact came during a patrol mission. Inside one subchaser's sonar room, the operator suddenly noticed something unusual. A steady echo, too regular to be a rock formation, too slow to be a passing wave. He leaned closer to the screen. "Contact," he called out. The captain stepped beside him. "Submarine," he said quietly. "Probably Japanese." Orders were given quickly. The ship turned sharply. Depth charges were prepared. Moments later, the charges rolled off the stern and plunged into the water. Several seconds passed. Then the explosions shook the hull. The ocean erupted with deep underwater blasts. The crew waited tensely. Then a final, heavier explosion rose from beneath the surface. Oil spread slowly across the water. Bits of wreckage floated upward. The crew exchanged quiet looks. They had just fought their first real battle, and won. But the hardest fight still lay ahead. The Soviet fleet was moving toward one of the most heavily defended islands in the region, Shumshu, and the landing there would test everything they had learned.
The island of Shumshu did not look impressive from a distance. From the sea, it appeared as little more than a dark line on the horizon. Jagged hills rose behind narrow beaches, and low clouds clung to the volcanic ridges like a gray blanket. But the Soviet crews approaching the island knew better. Beneath those rocky slopes waited Japanese defenses built over years of preparation. Concrete bunkers, hidden artillery, machine gun nests cut into the hillsides. The fleet approached cautiously in the early morning light. Transport ships carrying Soviet troops followed behind the escort vessels and subchasers that had been trained months earlier at Cold Bay. For several minutes, the coastline remained quiet. Too quiet. Sailors scanned the shore through binoculars, trying to pick out defensive positions hidden among the rocks. The sea rolled gently beneath the ships, and the sky hung low and colorless above them. Then the silence broke. A flash erupted from the hillside. A moment later, a shell screamed across the water and exploded just ahead of one of the transports, sending a column of spray high into the air. Another shell followed. This one landed closer. A third round howled past the bow of a subchaser before exploding behind it. Then suddenly, the entire shoreline erupted. Japanese artillery opened fire from multiple positions along the cliffs. Machine guns rattled across the beaches, while mortar shells dropped into the water around the approaching ships. The Soviet fleet reacted immediately. Subchasers turned toward the shore and began firing. The Bofors guns mounted on their decks roared to life, their barrels tracking the flashes of enemy artillery hidden among the rocks. Shells hammered the hillside. Explosions kicked up dirt and shattered stone. Minesweepers joined the barrage, their smaller guns pounding at suspected bunker positions along the coast. The ships shook with recoil as the crews fired again and again. Meanwhile, the transport's troops continued forward. Landing ramps dropped into the freezing water. Soviet soldiers jumped into the surf and pushed toward the narrow beaches while bullets splashed around them. Some stumbled in the waves. Others kept moving. Behind them, the ships kept firing. Radio messages filled the air. Enemy guns on northern ridge. Request suppressing fire. Transport taking heavy fire near the landing zone. One of the subchasers moved dangerously close to shore. The captain knew the risk, but the artillery position ahead was still firing directly into the landing area. "Closer," he ordered. "Give them everything." The gunners obeyed. Round after round slammed into the rocky slope where the Japanese battery was hidden. The hillside erupted with explosions. Then suddenly a massive blast tore through the position. A fuel cache or ammunition store had detonated. The artillery fire from that location stopped instantly.
On the beach, Soviet troops felt the pressure ease. They pushed forward across the sand toward the defensive lines above. The battle lasted for hours. The landing was chaotic. Some boats grounded too early. Others drifted off course in the waves. Japanese resistance remained fierce across parts of the island, but the Soviet ships continued supporting the assault from offshore. One minesweeper took a near miss from an artillery shell that peppered its deck with shrapnel. Railings were torn apart, and several crewmen were wounded. Still, the ship remained in position. The crew patched the damage as best they could and kept firing. By midday, the Soviet forces had secured a foothold on the island. By afternoon, they had begun pushing inland, and by evening, Japanese resistance had broken into scattered pockets across the hills. The ships offshore finally fell silent. Crews slumped against gun mounts and engine room walls, exhausted after the long battle. For the Soviet sailors trained at Cold Bay, the strange alliance with the Americans had carried them all the way to combat. American-built ships, Soviet crews, fighting together against Japan in one of the final battles of the Pacific War. But the war itself was about to end. The message arrived quietly over the radio. At first, the operators thought it might be an error. Then a second transmission confirmed it. Japan had agreed to surrender. Hostilities would soon cease. The reaction across the fleet was strange. No cheering, no celebration, just silence. For weeks, the sailors had expected more battles, more landings, more dangerous missions in the Kuril Islands. Instead, the war had ended almost suddenly. The guns cooled, engines slowed, and the ships waited for new orders. Soon, those orders arrived. They were short and formal. Transferred vessels are to be returned after the cessation of hostilities. Returned. The word spread quickly among the crews. Some sailors frowned in confusion. Others simply stared out across the ocean. These ships had carried them through storms and battle. To many of the Soviet sailors, they already felt like their own vessels. But the agreements made months earlier still stood. The ships had been loaned, not given. Some Soviet officers argued quietly about the decision. They had crossed an ocean to learn these vessels. They had fought with them. Some men had died aboard them. And now they were expected to hand them back. On the American side, the reasoning was simple. The war had ended. The Lend-Lease agreement required the ships to be returned. But politics was already beginning to change. The alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States was cooling rapidly. Suspicion was growing, and the ships that once symbolized cooperation now looked like bargaining pieces in a new geopolitical struggle. In the years that followed, some of the vessels were eventually returned to the United States. Others were not. They remained in Soviet service, repainted and renumbered until their American origins were almost forgotten. As the Cold War began, the story of Cold Bay faded into the background. It was not a dramatic battle. It was not a famous victory. It was something stranger. A secret naval school hidden at the edge of the world. A place where American instructors trained Soviet sailors to command ships built in American shipyards. For a brief moment in 1945, men from two nations that would soon become rivals stood together on the same decks, pointing at the same charts, preparing for the same enemy. Today, Cold Bay is quiet again. The docks are mostly empty. The old barracks have weathered under decades of wind and snow. Fog still rolls in from the Aleutian Sea just as it did in 1945. But if someone stood on those docks on a cold gray morning and listened carefully, they might almost imagine the sounds that once filled the harbor. Boots striking frozen planks, engines rumbling to life, orders shouted across the wind in two different languages. Project Hula did not change the course of the war by itself, but it did something remarkable. It brought together sailors from two very different nations and turned them into crews capable of fighting side by side. A secret fleet, a borrowed navy, a partnership born from necessity and finished almost as quickly as it began. One of the strangest and most human stories of World War II, and a story that almost no one remembers today.